Hey everyone, before this story pulls you in, take a second to ground yourself, because what you're about to hear is not just another tale of family drama. It's a rise from the ashes story, a reminder of what happens when a black woman is pushed to the edge and decides she will never beg for belonging again. If stories of quiet strength, delayed justice, and unstoppable glow-ups move you, then pause for a heartbeat, show love with a like, claim your space by subscribing, and welcome home to Black Queen Dominion. This story begins on a day dressed up as celebration, a day wrapped in silk, flowers, and forced smiles. It was supposed to be about unity, about families standing together while one sister stepped into a new chapter of her life. But underneath the white linens and polished shoes, something old and ugly had been waiting for its moment to breathe. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The venue shimmered with elegance, the guests glided from table to table, and the air hummed with approval. Inside, the narrator carried a lifetime of quiet endurance. She had grown up learning how to take up less space, how to soften her needs so others could feel bigger, how to swallow pain so family peace could exist. She had been the extra child, the one whose achievements were acknowledged but never celebrated, whose presence was tolerated but rarely cherished. She arrived at the wedding hopeful, even after years of being made to feel like an afterthought. Hope had always been her weakness and her strength. She believed that milestones softened hearts, that joy made room for forgiveness, that maybe today would be different. She wore grace like armor and walked in determined not to dim herself, even if she had learned to do so automatically. The ceremony unfolded beautifully, but something subtle shifted as the reception began. Laughter grew louder around her, not with her. Glances passed over her like she was part of the decor. Old memories stirred. Moments when her voice had gone unheard at dinner tables, when her tears had been dismissed as overreaction, when her needs were labeled inconvenient. Still, she stayed present, telling herself that grown people grow past childhood cruelty. Then came the moment meant to be light-hearted, the kind of moment families later describe as playful honesty. Attention turned toward her sister, glowing and confident, holding the room with ease. The narrator felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct that told her something was about to land wrong. And it did. Without warning, the sister framed cruelty as humor, reaching back into old family narratives and dragging them into the spotlight. The word landed like a slap, sharp and unmistakable. Unwanted. Not whispered, not implied, but presented openly, as if it were a harmless truth everyone already knew. The room reacted before the narrator could. There was laughter. Not nervous silence, not shock, but laughter that rolled easily from the mouths of the two people who were supposed to be her first protectors. Her parents laughed along, comfortable, amused, as though the label had never cut deep, as though it had never shaped how their daughter saw herself. Time slowed. The narrator felt her body react before her mind could catch up. Heat rushed to her face, her chest tightened, and a familiar voice inside tried to minimize the pain, telling her not to make a scene, reminding her that she had survived worse. But something was different this time. The pain did not turn inward. It crystallized. In that moment she saw her life clearly. She saw the years of overgiving, the emotional labor poured into relationships that returned crumbs. She saw how often she had been asked to be understanding while no one bothered to understand her. She saw how the word unwanted had been quietly reinforced through neglect, through comparison, through laughter at her expense. She stayed seated. She did not cry publicly. She did not argue or plead. Instead, she felt a door close inside her. The version of herself that kept hoping for approval stepped aside, making room for someone steadier, someone done asking. As the reception continued, she became invisible by choice. She observed instead of engaging, noticing patterns she had once excused. The ease with which her absence would go unnoticed. The comfort her family found in her silence. And with each observation, resolve grew. When the night ended, she left without announcement. No dramatic exit, no confrontation. Just a quiet departure that carried the weight of finality. Outside, under the open sky, she took a breath that felt like the first honest one she had taken in years. She understood then that the wound was real, but so was the clarity it brought. She did not yet know what revenge would look like or whether revenge was even the right word. What she knew was that she would never again shrink herself to fit into spaces that thrived on her smallness. And as she walked away from the echoes of laughter, she made a promise she would soon learn how to keep. The days following the wedding moved forward, but the narrator felt like she was living in a pause. The world around her resumed its rhythm, yet something fundamental had shifted. She replayed the moment not with obsession, but with analysis, as if her mind were finally allowing itself to see what her heart had long known. She noticed how no apology arrived. No message asking if she was okay. No attempt to smooth things over. The absence of acknowledgement spoke louder than the insult itself. It confirmed that the laughter had not been accidental. It had been permission. Instead of spiraling, she grew quiet in a way that unsettled even herself. She began pulling back, not dramatically but deliberately. She stopped initiating contact. She declined invitations with polite distance. She removed herself from family group chats, one muted notification at a time. Each small withdrawal felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. This quiet exit was not fueled by bitterness alone. It was guided by a deep understanding that healing required space and power required boundaries. She recognized that constantly explaining her pain to people invested in misunderstanding it had drained her for years. Now she chose conservation over confrontation. With distance came memory. She remembered being a child who learned early that love was conditional. She remembered accomplishments that were compared instead of celebrated. She remembered being told to be grateful for scraps of attention. The wedding had not created these wounds. It had simply exposed them under bright lights. Instead of collapsing under the weight of these realizations, she redirected her energy. She poured herself into work, into learning, into self-development with a hunger that surprised even her. Late nights once spent worrying were now spent building. She audited her finances, set new goals, and envisioned a life that did not orbit around family approval. The more she focused on herself, the more she noticed a change in how she carried her body. Her posture shifted. Her gaze steadied. She no longer felt the urge to explain her absence. Silence became her language and peace became her priority. Her parents eventually noticed the distance. Confusion replaced comfort. The family dynamic relied on her availability, her emotional labor, her willingness to smooth things over. Without her, small cracks began to show. But instead of rushing back to fix what was breaking, she stayed still. She understood now that being unwanted had been a narrative, not a truth. A story told so often it had begun to feel real. And like all stories, it could be rewritten. She sought community elsewhere, surrounding herself with people who saw her value without needing to be convinced. Friends who celebrated her wins without competition. Mentors who recognized her potential and pushed her further. Each interaction reinforced what her family never had, that she was not too much nor not enough. As weeks turned into months, her absence became undeniable. The same family that once laughed now wondered why she no longer showed up. But she did not return to prove a point. She remained focused on building a life so full that their opinions could no longer reach her. In quiet moments, the memory of the wedding still surfaced. Not as an open wound but as a marker. Before and after. She allowed herself to feel the sadness without letting it define her. She understood that forgiveness might come one day, but reconciliation was not owed. What she was building required clarity, and clarity required distance. She was becoming someone her younger self would have needed, someone who chose herself without apology. And as her life expanded, so did her understanding of power. Real power, she learned, did not announce itself. It moved silently, laying foundations, preparing for the moment when the world would have no choice but to notice. The laughter from that night faded into irrelevance, replaced by a new sound, the steady rhythm of a woman stepping fully into her worth. By the time the seasons changed, the narrator had changed with them. Not loudly, not in ways that demanded attention, but in ways that altered the foundation of her life. This was the phase no one applauded, the part of the journey that never made it into family stories or social media captions. This was where the real work happened. She began to understand that being called unwanted had shaped her instincts. It had taught her to overperform, to overgive, to stay useful so she could stay included. Once she saw that pattern clearly, she dismantled it piece by piece. She stopped saying yes out of fear. She stopped explaining her choices. She stopped shrinking her ambitions to appear humble. Her mornings became intentional. She woke earlier, not out of obligation but out of desire. Time that once belonged to anxiety now belonged to growth. She read books that reframed her understanding of power, identity, and legacy. She studied people who had built themselves from disregard into dominance. Their stories did not make her bitter. They made her strategic. At work she moved differently. She no longer waited to be noticed. She documented her contributions, spoke with clarity, and positioned herself where decisions were made. The confidence she carried was quiet but undeniable. People began to listen not because she demanded it, but because her presence commanded it. Opportunities followed preparation. A promotion came, then another responsibility that placed her closer to influence. Her name started circulating in rooms she had never been invited into before. She observed carefully, learning how systems worked, how loyalty was formed, how power shifted hands. She did not rush. She understood timing now. Financial independence became a priority. She paid off old debts, invested wisely, and built a safety net that no one could threaten. Money was no longer just survival, it was freedom. With each milestone she felt a deeper sense of security, one that did not depend on family approval or emotional validation. Her physical presence transformed alongside her internal one. She took care of her body not as punishment but as respect. Movement became ritual. Nutrition became nourishment. She no longer tried to disappear in rooms. She entered them grounded, aware of her worth, comfortable with being seen. Meanwhile, her absence continued to echo through her family. Gatherings felt incomplete. Old dynamics faltered without her mediating role. Questions arose, then assumptions, then quiet discomfort. Still no accountability came. And she no longer waited for it. Her sister's married life unfolded publicly, filled with curated joy and selective honesty. From a distance, the narrator watched without envy. She understood now that performance and fulfillment were not the same. The wedding insult had not been strength. It had been projection. And projections always reveal more about the source than the target. What surprised her most was the peace. She had expected anger to fuel her rise, but it was clarity instead. Anger burned fast, clarity endured. She no longer fantasized about confrontation. The need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding her had dissolved. Instead, she focused on legacy. She volunteered her time mentoring younger women who reminded her of herself. She shared lessons without bitterness, teaching them how to recognize subtle disrespect, how to set boundaries early, how to trust their intuition. Each conversation felt like healing a version of herself that had gone unprotected. Her parents eventually reached out, cautiously, confused by the distance but unwilling to examine its cause. The narrator received their attempts with neutrality. She neither chased reconciliation nor rejected it outright. She understood now that access to her life was a privilege, not a right. When she thought back to the wedding, the word unwanted no longer carried the same weight. It felt small, outdated, irrelevant. She had outgrown the narrative entirely. She saw now that what had been labeled as unwanted was actually uncontrollable. She had been the reminder of unfulfilled dreams, the mirror others avoided. The rise she was experiencing was not visible to those who expected her to stay small. It was happening behind the scenes, in decisions made without announcement, in standards raised without negotiation. She was becoming someone who could never again be reduced to a punchline. And then quietly the tables began to turn. Her success reached a point where it intersected with family reality. Her name appeared in spaces her parents respected. Her achievements became difficult to ignore. Extended relatives spoke her name with admiration. The same people who once laughed now listened differently. She noticed the shift without celebrating it. Validation from those who had harmed her no longer held power. What mattered was that she had built something real, something stable, something hers. The stage was being set, not for revenge fueled by cruelty, but for reckoning shaped by truth. She did not need to expose anyone. Life was doing that work on her behalf. As she stood firmly in her new reality, she understood that the most powerful response to humiliation was transformation. And hers was only beginning to show. By the time her life reached a rhythm that felt unshakable, the people who once dismissed her began to feel the weight of her absence in ways they could no longer ignore. What had started as quiet distance slowly transformed into a presence felt precisely because it was gone. She had become the missing piece no one thought would ever leave. Family events continued without her, but they lacked something essential. Conversations stalled where her insight once smoothed tension. Conflicts escalated where her patience once absorbed impact. Her parents, who had laughed at her humiliation, now found themselves navigating discomfort without their emotional buffer. For the first time, they had to sit with consequences instead of outsourcing harmony. The narrator watched these shifts from afar, not with satisfaction but with awareness. She had learned that growth often made others uncomfortable, especially those who benefited from her smaller self. She no longer felt compelled to rescue situations she did not create. Silence had become her boundary and peace was the reward. Her professional world continued expanding. She stepped into leadership spaces that required decisiveness and vision. The lessons learned from family dynamics sharpened her instincts. She recognized manipulation quickly. She trusted her discernment. She no longer mistook familiarity for loyalty. Recognition followed results. Her work spoke loudly even when she did not. Invitations arrived that acknowledged her authority, not her availability. Her confidence no longer needed to announce itself. It was evident in the way she navigated rooms, negotiated opportunities, and walked away from what did not align. As her visibility increased, so did the curiosity from her family. Questions came indirectly at first, passed through relatives who suddenly remembered her existence. Compliments arrived wrapped in surprise, as though her success were unexpected. She received these gestures with polite distance, understanding that admiration without accountability was still avoidance. Her sister, once so comfortable labeling her, now faced her own reality. Marriage did not erase insecurity. Public celebration did not guarantee private fulfillment. Comparisons resurfaced, but this time the narrator was no longer participating. She did not compete. She did not explain. She existed fully outside the frame that once tried to contain her. The word unwanted surfaced again in her thoughts one evening, not as pain but as irony. She realized how often people labeled what they could not control. Her independence had disrupted a system built on her compliance. Her growth had exposed truths no one wanted to address. In that sense, unwanted had never meant unworthy. It had meant inconvenient. Her parents eventually asked to meet. Not directly, not apologetically, but cautiously, as if unsure of their standing. She considered the request carefully. She did not rush. She understood now that access to her presence was not automatic. It required respect, something that had to be demonstrated, not assumed. When she agreed, it was on her terms. Neutral ground. Limited time. Clear boundaries. She did not prepare speeches or rehearse emotions. She showed up grounded, aware, unafraid. The woman who entered that space was not the daughter who once absorbed ridicule in silence. She was someone else entirely. The dynamic shifted immediately. Her parents sensed it even if they could not name it. She was calm, not cold. Present, not pleading. She did not revisit the wedding unless necessary. She did not demand apologies. She allowed the discomfort to speak for itself. Sometimes, silence delivered truths more effectively than confrontation ever could. They attempted nostalgia, referencing moments when she had been more accessible, more accommodating. She did not take the bait. She responded without resentment, without eagerness to reconnect at her own expense. For the first time, they experienced her as an equal, not an extension. After the meeting, she felt no rush of relief or validation. What she felt was confirmation. She had done the work. She had healed enough to show up without losing herself. Whether they changed or not no longer determined her peace. Her life outside her family continued flourishing. She traveled, explored, invested in experiences that expanded her worldview. She built relationships rooted in mutual respect. She laughed freely, loved intentionally, and rested without guilt. The woman she was becoming no longer needed to prove her worth to anyone. People began to speak her name differently. Not as an afterthought but as a reference point. Her story circulated not as gossip but as inspiration. She had become evidence of what happens when a woman chooses herself without apology. The wedding that once marked her humiliation now felt distant, almost unreal. The memory had lost its power. What remained was the lesson. That sometimes rejection is redirection, and laughter at your pain is the final push you need to leave a place you were never meant to stay. She understood now that revenge did not always arrive as downfall. Sometimes it arrived as elevation. Sometimes it looked like peace so deep it confused those who expected bitterness. Sometimes it was simply living well without explanation. And as she stood firmly in her new reality, she knew one final truth. The story was not over yet. There was still a reckoning ahead, not driven by anger but by inevitability. Life had a way of balancing scales when people refused to. The reckoning did not arrive with fireworks or confrontation. It came the way truth often does, quietly, steadily, and without asking for permission. By the time it reached her family, the narrator had already crossed a threshold they could never follow her through. She was no longer reacting to what had been done to her. She was living in response to who she had become. Her life had settled into alignment. Not perfection but purpose. Every choice reflected intention rather than obligation. She woke up grounded, moved through her days with clarity, and rested without the heaviness she once carried. The need to be seen by those who had dismissed her had dissolved completely. She no longer measured her worth against their recognition. The final shift came when her success stopped being abstract. It was no longer just promotions and quiet achievements. It became visible in ways that demanded acknowledgement. Her name appeared publicly, attached to leadership, impact, and influence. People who once overlooked her now referenced her with pride, even when they did not understand her journey. Her parents heard about her accomplishments from others before they heard from her. Extended family spoke of her with admiration that bordered on awe. Strangers celebrated her resilience without knowing the cost. And slowly, painfully, the truth settled in for those who had laughed at her humiliation. She had risen without them. There was no triumphant announcement, no pointed reminder of the wedding. She never brought it up. He never needed to. The contrast spoke loudly enough. The daughter they had minimized had become a woman they could not ignore. And that realization carried its own weight. Her sister felt it most acutely. The roles they had grown into as children no longer applied. The hierarchy that once placed one above the other had dissolved. Comparison, once used as a weapon, now felt uncomfortable. The narrator did not engage. She did not compete. She existed fully outside the dynamic that once defined them. When her sister reached out, it was tentative, layered with unspoken regret and unresolved insecurity. The narrator listened without reopening wounds. She did not demand apologies or explanations. She understood that accountability was a journey others had to choose for themselves. Her role was no longer to guide them there. What surprised everyone, including herself, was the absence of resentment. She had expected forgiveness to be difficult, but she realized she had already done the hardest part, releasing the need for closure from people who lacked the tools to give it. Forgiveness for her was not reconciliation. It was freedom. The word unwanted no longer belonged to her story. It had lost its meaning entirely. She saw now that she had never been unwanted. She had been uncontrollable, unmanageable, unwilling to conform to a role designed to keep her small. And for people invested in comfort over truth, that had been threatening. She reclaimed her narrative fully. Not by rewriting the past but by refusing to let it dictate her future. She honored the younger version of herself who had endured silently, who had believed love had to be earned, who had stayed too long in spaces that laughed at her pain. That version no longer needed protection. She had become the protector. Her story began inspiring others. Women reached out, sharing how they had been labeled, dismissed, minimized. They saw themselves in her journey, not in the humiliation but in the rise. She used her platform intentionally, not to shame her family, but to illuminate a truth many avoided. That sometimes the deepest wounds come from those closest to us, and healing does not require their permission. She spoke about boundaries without bitterness. About walking away without guilt. About choosing yourself even when it costs you familiarity. Her message resonated because it was lived, not performed. The wedding that once marked her lowest point had become a turning point she no longer feared remembering. It was the moment the mask fell, the illusion shattered, the final confirmation she needed to stop asking for a seat at tables built on her silence. She had built her own. And it was abundant. In moments of reflection she felt gratitude, not for the pain itself but for the clarity it forced. Without that humiliation she might have stayed. She might have continued shrinking. She might have spent her life trying to prove her worth to people who benefited from her doubt. Instead she chose herself. She understood now that revenge did not require retaliation. It required elevation. It required living so fully, so authentically, that the past could no longer reach you. Her peace was not loud, but it was undeniable. Her joy was not performative, but it was real. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman crowned not by approval but by resilience. A woman who did not need validation from the people who once laughed at her pain. A woman who had learned that family is not defined by blood alone, but by respect, safety, and love. She had become everything they never expected, and everything she always deserved to be. And as her story settled into its truth, one final lesson remained clear. When a Black woman rises after being humiliated, she does not return to explain herself. She builds a life so powerful that her absence becomes the loudest answer of all.